Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it has been, what, a week and a half since I wrapped up playing Pikarom for 4 to 5 months straight. I am in need of a bit of a palate cleanser, and, you know, while I was at the mall the other day, I noticed that the Vivid Voltage theme decks were out. Sadly, Charizard was all gone because people love their Charizard and are willing to drive the prices up to like 25 bucks a theme deck for each, but regardless, there were a bunch of Drednaw theme decks left over, and I figured, you know what, let me scoop up a pair, see what we can do, see if we can upgrade them to make them a bit more competitively viable. So to that end, we've got two. We're going to crack them open, and we're going to see if we can make something workable out of these. I can't promise they're going to be the Charizard of this generation or the Roaring Resolve one from Team Up, but who knows? We might be able to hone in on a core there and make things work. So I'm going to be right back. I'm going to open up both of these, and we will kind of flip through the cards and see what we're working with. Okay, so we've got our foil Drednaw. This is supposed to be the big boss monster of the deck. So basically for 1 water and 2 colorless, you do 80 damage with Vice Wave, but if you played Nessa, the supporter from your hand this turn, your opponent's Pokemon is now paralyzed. 3 for 80 is terrible. Requiring a supporter for the additional effect is really bad. 140 vanilla attack for 2 water and 2 colorless is also kind of terrible on a stage 1. So as much as they're pushing this to be the big boss of the deck, we're actually just going to put it aside, because in looking at the deck list a little bit, I see that there's a more interesting core to be found in here. So let's see, after we get by the absurd amount of water energies. So Nessa the supporter is still going to play a big part in what's going on, but this is really what we're looking for. That and this bad boy here. So, Cramorant is really interesting because it is a basic Pokemon and it has this really interesting attack called Continuous Gulp Missile, where you can discard any number of Arrokuda from your bench and you do 60 damage for each one you discarded in that way. So, if you have 1, you're doing 60. If you discard 4, you're doing 240, which is enough to body a good chunk of the tag teams out there, Pikarom for example. It's also a really good way to severely injure all of the VMAXs out there, and if you're hitting for weakness in the case of like Centiskorch or Charizard VMAX, you get in the clean KO. So, it's a little tricky though, because obviously this requires a lot of resources every turn to work. You need the Twin Energy for the Cramorant, you need to have your Arrokuda on the bench, you've just discarded them all. What are you going to do? Now, there's not really any recovery in this deck beyond Nessa, but Nessa's pretty good, because you can put 4 in any combination of water energy or water Pokemon back into your hand. So the basic idea is you get down your Cramorant, fill your bench with these guys, Continuous Gulp Missile, and then the next turn you play Nessa, recover your Arrokuda, rinse and repeat. Right? Now, there's not a lot of support to do that in the deck. Actually, most of the supporters in here are pretty terrible. As are most of the Pokemon. So, basically, we're going to be using a few things like the Ball Search here, the few good supporters like Prof's Research, and then maybe this Barraskewda as well, which allows you to basically do what the Esper did, I think, from Unbroken Bonds, where you do 20 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon for each damage counter on them. So, if you wound something and then it retreats, or you gust something fresh up into the active, you can actually use this to deal out some pretty serious damage if you're following up a Continuous Gulp Missile. So, long story short, we're going to focus on this core here, totally ignoring pretty much everything else in this deck with the exception of a few Great Balls and the Prof's Research. Generally speaking, my belief is that if you grab 2 theme decks and then you grab a Trainer's Toolkit or 2, you can actually take a core out of pretty much any theme deck and make it at least competitively viable. For the early rungs of the PTCGO ladder, I think something like this will do well enough. And we'll see. I'm going to take a little time. I'm going to jump over to PTCGO and I'm going to try and, throw together a somewhat consistent, cramified version of this Nessa Drednaw Theme Deck. So yeah, give me a little time, and then we will jump into some games and see if this is literally just a meme deck or if it's the new Baby Lounge.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I've had a little while to play with the cards, and after shuffling things around a little bit, trying this and that, here's what I came up with. Now, to be honest, you're not going to take the top spot at the Player's Cup with this deck, but I do think it'll help you learn the fundamentals of the game and, net you a cheeky win every now and then. Like I mentioned earlier, most of the Drednaw deck is not very good, including the boss monster itself, Drednaw. 3 for 80 damage and paralysis if you play a supporter. That's not... No. So instead, I've stripped away pretty much everything that didn't have to do with Cramorant, and I've built the deck up to play to Cramorant's strengths. So with Cramorant as our new boss monster, let's look at what it has to offer. It has one attack, but that one attack is its big selling point. Continuous Gulp Missile lets us do 60 damage for every Arrokuda we discard from our bench, up to a max of 240 damage because you can only play 4 of any Pokemon, so 4 Arrokuda is all you're going to get at most. Now, that is enough damage to knock out a lot of tag teams, notably Pikarom, and pretty much every Pokemon V out there with the exception, I think, of Wailord and maybe the new Steelix. And, if you're hitting for weakness, you can even fell Titans like Centiskorch VMAX or Charizard VMAX, which is kind of awesome. As for Arrokuda, our figurative ammo, it's pretty basic. It has pitiful stats for a wee basic fishy, but it does have its own useful attack. So the attack, called Flock, lets you search your deck for up to 2 more Arrokuda and place them on your bench. And it's really nice that you can pay for this with 1 colorless, so you could use a Capture Energy, basic water, whatever you wanted to use basically. It's really good to set up your bench, particularly if you don't start Cramorant and you don't have a way to switch it in right away. It's also good to replace itself, essentially, if it's stuck in the active and you know it's going to go down. In terms of recovery, you have Nessa and Ordinary Rod. Nessa is preferable because you can put any combination of water Pokemon and water energy up to 4 back into your hand, while Ordinary Rod lets you put up to 2 Pokemon and or up to 2 energy back into your deck. Now, because of the way Cramorant's attack works, you basically need to be recycling Arrokuda every turn in order to keep up the pressure on your opponent. So ideally, you play Nessa, especially if you've used Cramorant's attack the turn before, because you just scoop up all the Arrokuda you discarded and place them back on your bench. If you have to use Ordinary Rod, that means you're going to have to probably use a Professor's Research, your Ball Search, to dig for those Arrokuda and get them back. So really, this deck does have a good matchup against multi-prize attackers, as we've discussed, by virtue of the fact that you are a 1-prize deck, and you can deal out some pretty crazy damage. As with anything, like Baby Blacephalon, for example, you really have to pick your KOs. It's not worth it to dump a bunch of fire energy in the case of Baby Blounds in order to take out a 1-prizer. As much as possible, you want to be focusing down big juicy targets like VMAXs and tag teams, right? It's the same kind of case here. You need to maximize the number of prizes you're going to take, and when you can't do that, you need to settle for eliminating targets that are going to slow down your opponent's game plan. So for example, taking out Jirachi, opposing Oricorio, Zacian if that's their draw engine, things like that. And that's the deck in a nutshell. So let's jump into some games and see how well this does. I am a little skeptical, but I'm pretty happy that the ladder reset recently and I'm not too high up because, oh boy, this is going to be an uphill battle. So if you guys watched my sealed only series, link in the description, then this is usually where I jump into a detailed play-by-play of the game, but since we're doing something a little different here, I thought I'd change things up. So instead, I'm going to talk about how this deck plays within the context of this game. So early on, off my opponent's mulligan, I got the idea that if it wasn't an out-and-out Scizor VMAX deck, it would be some sort of bulky steel deck because, I see things like weakness card energy, for example. However, when my opponent led a Scyther alongside a Galarian Meowth and a Galarian Stunfisk, I realized that this was probably more of a steel box deck, to use a generous term. Now, steel decks regardless are notorious for reducing damage, so this is one of those cases where I would have to really carefully choose my targets and carefully consider the timing of my attacks as well. Basically, if my opponent is reducing damage to the point where I have to discard my entire bench just to scratch them, then that's not really going to fly as a winning strategy. So right off the bat, I wanted to establish a lead in the prizes, because the presence of Scyther showed that my opponent would have 1 prize attackers in their deck, which would make for a very inefficient prize race on my part. And this sort of bore out in the early game because my opponent was able to take the first prize using a regular old Scizor, leaving me to do a lot of work in order to recover. Now, luckily for me, Oricorio and my draw supporters gave me what I needed to get back in the game and actually get up on the prize race. I recognized that my opponent had put down a Galarian Stunfisk, which was a nice juicy 2-prize attacker, and while I wasn't able to OHKO it, I was able to strand it out in the active and deal enough damage to it that it was basically doomed before it would be able to use its very painful Snap Trap attack and KO my Cramorant in revenge. Right, so this put me up in the prize race, which allowed me to more comfortably proceed with the rest of the game. Now, once this deck does get ahead, as long as you can re-establish your Arrokuda every turn and maybe have a backup Cramorant on hand, then you can pretty well keep pace with your opponent. Tool cards like Lucky Egg, for example, are really fantastic. Baby Blounce is used to great success because when your Pokemon is knocked out, you can replenish your hand up to 7. And having things like a backup attacker in Kangaskhan also prove wise because you have a big, beefy revenge attacker to help you buy some time until you can get another Cramorant and your Arrokuda set up. Now, Pokemon like Kangaskhan, the Evil Admonition Hoopa, other colorless energy attackers are good in these types of decks because sometimes you just need to get a bit of damage on board before you can take KOs with your main attackers. Cramorant, for example, hits a max of 240, which is a great number, but 270 is also a pretty notable number. That's where a lot of tag teams cap out. So you need to do 30 damage ahead of time, otherwise you're mortally wounding them, yes, but you're not taking them out. With Rally Back, even if you don't get the effect of having your opponent KO your Pokemon before, thus allowing it to do 120 damage, Rally Back allows me to chip the opposing Pokemon for that critical 30, and then I can follow up with a max of 240 for a nice clean knockout. In this case, Kangaskhan was good because it allowed me to spread damage around the board on my opponent's main attackers, and it was an efficient way to go about it because my opponent was trying to reduce damage, attaching things like Big Charm, all that, in order to make my KOs take a little bit more. So because I dented so much stuff with Kangaskhan early on, Cramorant was able to come in and clean up without requiring too many Arrokudas on the bench. Now, another thing to note in this game is that the generous amount of gusting actually came into play here. I knew I would eventually have to face down a Scizor V, possibly a Scizor V Max, which my opponent did eventually put down, and decided to bulk it up a bit more with Cape of Toughness. So now I was staring down a 260 HP Pokemon, which I can't take out with one continuous Gulp Missile, and because Kangaskhan was not a factor anymore, I would have to rely on Cramorant. Luckily for me, I had plenty of Pokemon catchers and Phione on hand, so I was able to just get that big beefy boy out of the way and take out some of the squishier targets on my opponent's bench in order to take the game. This next game is a perfect example of how to deal with any other single prize attacking decks. In this case, my opponent was piloting a Zacian Amazing Rare deck, and I have to be honest, I didn't even understand what I was playing against or how it worked until a few turns in. The basic idea is that my opponent wanted to use a combination of Turbo Patches and Trumbeak to accelerate to a Zacian Amazing Rare, allowing it to plow through opposing teams with a 150 damage attack that actually deals 300 if you dare to play down a VMAX on the field. Now, just looking at the damage output, Zacian is easily able to KO my Cramorant, So I needed to take the first KO if possible, and then I needed to ensure a constant stream of Arrokuda to get the damage I needed. Now, in this case, it would only take 2 Arrokuda to KO each Zacian because Zacian capped out at 110 HP. Now, the nice thing here too is that, like a lot of single prize attackers of this nature, my opponent's deck also had some resource management challenges of its own. In particular, the amazing rare cards have super awkward attack costs, so it wasn't a simple matter of easily accelerating energy to Zacian. It would take a little bit of work. It was reliant on things like coin flips from turbo patches or the luck of the draw off the top of your deck using Trumbeak. So in theory, all I had to do was stay ahead of energy acceleration or make my opponent waste their attachments in order for me to maintain a lead. Now, I was able to get the first KO, and that meant my opponent had to invest some serious resources in order to get a second Zacian set up. Now, luckily for me, while Zacian does have one attack that allows it to accelerate to itself, it only does 30 damage, and so I could hang on with my active Cramorant and, basically be allowed to attack at least twice. Or if not, set up a new Cramorant and replenish my bench in order to take the revenge KO. And really, as long as my opponent didn't take out too many of my twin energies with Crushing Hammers, which I was a little sloppy in, preserving myself, I would be okay. And, I do keep a fair amount of single energy attachments, capture energy, water energy, just in case. Now, my opponent did get pretty close to setting up their second Zacian, but I was able to take it out before it could really start tearing through my board, and that put them in a bit of a tough spot. At this point, if they really wanted to catch up, they would have to get 3 energies on board, despite being down several turbo patches and having used most of their bench space to evolve into Trumbeaks already. They would have to do all that, while all I would have to do is continuously stream Nessas in order to cycle Cramorant's attack. And realistically looking at it, even if my opponent took a prize, thanks to some aggressive deck thinning on my part, courtesy of Lucky Egg and Professor's research, I would pretty much always have a full hand and be able to grab anything I needed in order to respond and keep the prize race going. So really, this game kind of just got to the point where my opponent wasn't able to get another Zacian on board, and I'm not sure if they played any backup attackers because pretty soon after I'd taken out that second Zacian, they ended up scooping. So yeah, this deck is fun. I'm not gonna lie, there was a lot of trial and error before I got a workable deck out of the Drednaw Theme Decks. I hate to say it, but yeah, the theme deck really is subpar from the outset. The Charizard is definitely the better of the two. And, while it did have this little nugget of Cramorant and the Arrokuda package in it, that still doesn't make it stellar when you decide to build up the deck around that instead. So really, look, this theme deck, with some serious tweaking, is fine to pick up if you just want to have like a fun game here or there, or learn the basics. In focusing on Cramorant, you do see that you have to make really good plays in order to come away with the win, even from the most favorable matchups. Grinding with this thing on the PTCGO ladder will definitely make you a better player. You may lose your sanity, but you will improve. And that about wraps it up. If you guys enjoyed this, or if you'd like to see more of these theme deck upgrades, please like the video and maybe leave a comment below with a suggestion for which deck I should tackle next. I would just ask, if you're going to suggest something though, please suggest something where most of the cards are standard legal. Basically, none of the theme decks from Lost Thunder or back, if only because it's already impossible to find most stuff IRL, and I don't want to have to replace 99% of the deck to make it standard legal for PTCGO. I'm not trying to go into Expanded with a pair of theme decks and get curb stomped every week. Not about it. So yeah, any suggestions are welcome. If I can, I will try and get my hands on Charizard, but at $25 a pop for rapidly dwindling supplies, we'll see. I might have to leave that to better YouTubers. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. I am steadily creeping up on 100 subs, and I do already have something special planned for that milestone. So, help me get there. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for now. So until next time, take it easy.